"Go have the baby alone," said the Millionaire CEO. But a year and a half later he saw them with triplets and froze. The airport was loud until it wasn't. One moment Tristan Deco was striding through Terminal B, jaw tight, phone pressed to his ear, negotiating a 7-figure acquisition. The next, his world stalled mid-step. Across the terminal stood a woman he had not seen in a year and a half, Michaela Ross. She was thinner, hair pulled into a loose knot, coat slipping from one shoulder as she tried to manage 3 toddlers who had decided the entire gate belonged to them. One clutched her scarf like a lifeline, another knelt to inspect a crack in the tile. The third looked straight at Tristan, curious, unafraid, and waved. "Hi, mister." The word landed harder than any headline ever had. His phone slid from his hand and struck the floor. He didn't notice. He was staring at 3 faces that carried pieces of his own, eyes, brows, expressions he had never earned the right to recognize. The first time Tristan Deco saw his children, he didn't know they were his, not until that single word found him. Most people carry at least one moment they wish they could reopen. A phone call left unanswered because the timing felt wrong. A conversation postponed until tomorrow that never came. A goodbye said too quickly because staying meant admitting something was changing. We tell ourselves we'll circle back when life is calmer, when things feel less complicated, when we're ready to face what we've been avoiding. But time doesn't wait for courage. It moves on whether we keep up or not. Some chances don't fade quietly. They close without warning. So as Tristan stood there in the middle of that terminal, staring at a woman he once loved and children he had never held, he wasn't just seeing a family. He was seeing every decision he had rushed through, every door he had shut too soon, every excuse he had dressed up as logic. And if you've ever walked away from something important because staying felt uncomfortable, this moment already belongs to you too. Tristan Deco didn't avoid people because he was heartless. He avoided them because he was efficient. Every part of his life ran on the same rule: if something threatened control, remove it before it grew teeth. Deals were closed early. Friendships were kept light. Relationships were treated like contracts with quiet exit clauses. It worked, on paper. At 35 he had a corner office, a reputation that bent rooms in his direction, and a calendar packed so tight it left no space for mistakes. What he didn't have was the one thing he never learned how to manage: what happens when life refuses to fit inside a plan. Michaela wasn't a crisis. She was proof that his system had limits. Because the truth wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he had mastered the art of deleting people the moment they stopped being simple, long before they had a chance to matter. So here's the question that refuses to leave him alone, as the noise of the terminal rushes back into his ears. What does it take to shake a man who has never needed anyone? What force is strong enough to cut through decades of discipline, ambition, and carefully managed distance? Because Tristan didn't fall apart when deals collapsed or markets dipped. He didn't hesitate when people walked out of his life. He had trained himself to keep moving, to step over discomfort instead of staying long enough to feel it. Yet now he couldn't lift his feet from the floor. 3 small voices were tugging at a woman he once dismissed with a single sentence. 3 lives were waiting at the edge of his vision, quietly asking him to do the one thing he had never mastered. Stay, not for a meeting, not for a strategy session, but for a future that would not pause while he decided whether he was ready, and whether he could finally face the cost of every clean exit he ever made. Before we go any further, take a second to check something. If stories about second chances pull at you, if you've ever wished you could revisit a single choice and take a different path, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. This channel isn't about perfect people or clean victories. It's about the moments that don't come with instructions, the ones that ask something from us when we least expect it. So if you want more stories that explore those hard turns, the ones that change who we become, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Cooper's Stories. You don't have to watch every episode. Just stay close enough to catch the ones that feel like they were written for you. The terminal dissolves. Glass walls replace boarding gates. Carpet replaces tile. The soft chatter of travelers gives way to the faint hum of air conditioning in a corner office 30 floors above the city. Tristan is standing with his back to the door, eyes fixed on the skyline as if the buildings themselves are waiting for his approval. Behind him, a voice trembles. "I'm pregnant." He doesn't turn around. He adjusts his cufflink, checks the time, keeps his attention on a calendar filled months into the future. "Get rid of it," he says, the way he might cancel a meeting he never wanted to attend. Silence expands in the room. "I won't," Michaela replies, barely louder than a breath. "I just thought you should know." That's when he finally faces her, not with anger but with certainty, the kind that leaves no room for negotiation. "This isn't happening," he says. "I don't do complications." Then he gives her the instruction that will echo through every moment that follows. Go have the baby alone. Tristan Deco learned early that needs were inconvenient. His mother worked double shifts at a hospital on the east side of Milwaukee. She left before sunrise and returned long after dark, exhausted in ways no child knows how to translate. His father was present in name only, a man who drifted between jobs and moods, who never raised his voice yet never offered warmth either. Their apartment felt more like a waiting room than a home. No one ever heard Tristan. No one really noticed him, either. At 8 years old, he learned to pour his own cereal, to button his own shirts, to stop asking whether anyone would be at his school performances. He stopped bringing home permission slips that required a signature because it was easier to forge one than to remind his parents he existed. What he needed most wasn't food or supervision. It was acknowledgement, but attention was scarce, and he absorbed that scarcity like a rule: don't ask for what you can't afford to need. At night, when the building settled and every other apartment glowed with televisions and conversation, Tristan lay awake listening to the pipes click behind the walls, telling himself that quiet was safer than disappointment. He grew into a child who never cried in public, who never reached first, who learned how to leave a room emotionally long before he ever walked out of one. Teachers praised his independence. Relatives admired how mature he was. No one recognized the pattern forming. A boy who survived by shrinking his expectations, who treated connection as something temporary, who decided that if he never needed too much, no one could ever fail him. By the time he left for college, he already carried the blueprint for the man he would become, someone who could live beside others without ever leaning on them, someone who mistook silence for strength and solitude for control. And control, he would later discover, felt like the closest thing to safety he had ever known. By the time Tristan entered the corporate world, leaving had become second nature. He wasn't dramatic about it. There were no slammed doors or fiery speeches. He exited with courtesy, with timing, with a professionalism that made people blame themselves for feeling abandoned. He mastered the art of closing chapters before anyone else realized the story was ending. In college, he switched majors twice without explanation, dropping friendships the same way, slowly, politely, until no one bothered asking why he stopped showing up. After graduation, he climbed companies like ladders, staying just long enough to be admired before moving on to something cleaner, higher, safer. Relationships followed the same template. Dates were charming, dinners were thoughtful, mornings were efficient. Then, inevitably, someone would ask a question that didn't fit inside his calendar. Where is this going? What do you want from us? Those were his exit cues. He never argued. He never raised his voice. He simply redefined the situation until the other person felt unreasonable for wanting more. By the time they realized they were being left behind, he was already gone. Message threads left unanswered, plans forgotten, the air between them closed without ceremony. People described him as focused, driven, disciplined, but underneath that polish was a pattern that had nothing to do with ambition. It was avoidance with better grammar. Every departure reinforced the same lesson he'd learned as a child. Staying meant exposure. Exposure meant disappointment. Leaving early meant never having to test that theory. So he left. From apartments that still held his scent, from teams that thought he was invested, from women who mistook his consistency for commitment. Each clean exit felt like proof that he was in control. And every time he walked away before things became complicated, the emptiness he left behind followed him, quiet, unremarked, efficient as ever. By 35, Tristan no longer believed he had a problem. He believed he had a system. His days were scheduled down to the minute, not because he was busy, but because predictability calmed him. If he could see the shape of his week, nothing inside it could ambush him. He ate the same breakfasts, took the same routes to work, reserved the same table at the same restaurant every Thursday night. Even his penthouse reflected the rule. White walls, minimal furniture, no photographs. Nothing that suggested a life had happened there before he arrived or would remain after he left. Control wasn't about power. It was about insulation. As long as everything stayed organized, he never had to feel the edges of uncertainty. He didn't need to trust anyone because he trusted systems. Contracts didn't disappoint. Metrics didn't hesitate. Numbers never asked him to show up emotionally. That was why his success didn't feel like an achievement. It felt like confirmation. Every promotion, every acquisition, every praise-filled board meeting was proof that discipline beat attachment, that staying light on his feet kept him from being pulled under by expectations he never agreed to carry. And then Michaela arrived with news that couldn't be reduced to a spreadsheet. A life didn't fit inside his model. There was no clause to revise, no calendar slot to move, no polite way to optimize the reality of becoming responsible for someone else's existence. Pregnancy wasn't a challenge to be managed. It was a surrender. And surrender, in Tristan's language, translated to danger. So he reached for the only defense he trusted. He tightened his grip. He simplified the situation until it resembled a problem he could delete. Because if control was safety, then anything that threatened control had to be removed, no matter how much it mattered to the person standing in front of him. Michaela didn't break Tristan's rules. She made him forget them. She was never impressed by his job titles, or the way rooms shifted when he spoke. She didn't wait for permission to tease him about his perfectly pressed shirts, or the fact that his refrigerator held more sparkling water than actual food. With her, He laughed without checking the time. Their nights weren't efficient. They cooked too late, talked too long, stayed in bed after alarms went off because the world felt quieter when it wasn't scheduled. For the first time in his adult life, he was late to meetings for reasons that had nothing to do with ambition. And it terrified him, because connection didn't arrive politely. It made demands without sending calendar invites. It slipped past his defenses and started occupying parts of his life he had never budgeted for, so he compensated. He bought her expensive gifts instead of offering consistency. He replaced real conversations with reservations at better restaurants. He kept his sharp suit pressed even when she asked him to leave work at the door. Then came the day she stood in that office with eyes that had lost their usual certainty. The suit jacket went over the chair like it always did. The lights came on automatically. His phone lit up with a message from her that he didn't open. Then another. Then silence. He stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by everything he had once wanted. Space, order, control. And for the first time, none of it settled him. Because systems are only useful when life agrees to stay inside them. And somewhere between a sharp suit, an empty apartment, and unread words waiting on a screen, Tristan felt the first crack in a philosophy he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Not loud, not dramatic. It leads nowhere. The meeting before Michaela arrived ran long. Tristan didn't notice at first. He was standing at the head of the table while 6 executives waited for his approval, eyes tracking the movement of his pen as he crossed out entire sections of a proposal without comment. The numbers were good, the forecasts clean, yet he still felt an irritation he couldn't name. By the time the last person filed out, he was already thinking about the call he hadn't returned the night before. Michaela had left a message, not long, not dramatic, just quiet enough to feel heavy. "We need to talk." He disliked that phrase more than any other. It never meant clarity. It meant variables. It meant something was about to escape the boundaries he'd set. So when his assistant said her name, he didn't turn around. "Send her in," he said, eyes still on the skyline beyond the glass. He heard the door close, felt her presence in the room before she spoke. There was a weight to silence when it came from someone who normally filled space with warmth. He adjusted his watch, checked the time, gave her a few more seconds than courtesy required. She cleared her throat. He waited, not because he was unkind, but because somewhere deep he already knew that whatever she was about to say wouldn't be something he could solve. And problems he couldn't solve had no place in his office. "I'm pregnant." The words didn't echo. They didn't crash. They simply settled into the room as if they had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Tristan remained facing the window. Below them, traffic folded into itself with disciplined indifference, everyone moving somewhere important, no one pausing long enough to see him standing there with his world shifting behind his back. He told himself to ask a question, to respond like a reasonable person, to acknowledge the courage it must have taken for her to stand there alone. Instead, he tightened his grip on the pen in his hand until the plastic bit into his skin. "This is not a good time," he said at last. She didn't answer. He could hear her breathing, uneven now, like she was steadying herself against a tide he couldn't see. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quietly. "I just thought you deserved to know." The word unsettled him more than the news. He turned then, finally meeting her eyes. They were wide but not pleading. There was fear in them, yes, but also resolve. Whatever she was asking of him, it wasn't permission. "You should reconsider," he said, keeping his tone measured. "There are options. I've already decided." He nodded once, as if she had confirmed a scheduling conflict rather than the existence of a future he hadn't planned for. "I don't do complications," he replied. The sentence felt borrowed even as he spoke it, lifted from the language of contracts and negotiations. He watched it land between them and saw something in her expression close, not anger, not disbelief, something quieter, acceptance. That was when he realized he had lost control of the conversation, and that realization, more than anything she had said, made his chest tighten. Silence occupied the office the way fog fills a street, not sudden, not loud, just enough to make everything feel uncertain. Michaela folded her hands in front of her, a small, careful motion that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with survival. "You don't have to be involved," she said. "I wasn't asking for that." Her words were meant to protect him. They did the opposite, because if she didn't need him, then the future could still be simplified, reduced to something he could step around instead of through. "Good," he replied. The word came out too quickly. He softened his voice, adjusted his stance, the way he did when smoothing over tense boardrooms. "This is a lot to put on someone," he added. "I don't think either of us benefits from turning this into something it doesn't have to be." She waited, eyes fixed on a spot just above his shoulder, as if she were already practicing how to look past him. He took a breath, assembling the sentence the way he assembled every exit. Clean edges, no sentiment, no openings. Go have the baby alone. It wasn't cruel. That was the problem. It was reasonable. Delivered with calm efficiency, stripped of anger or blame. He offered it like a solution rather than a dismissal. Michaela didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She nodded once, slowly, as if she were agreeing to terms she hadn't come in to negotiate. Okay, she said. One word, no emphasis, no argument. Then she turned and walked out of the office without looking back. Tristan watched the door close and waited for the familiar relief that followed every clean departure. It didn't come. What came instead was a hollow pressure behind his ribs. Not regret, not yet, just the sensation that something had shifted into a place he could not reach. And for the first time, he wondered if he had mistaken control for certainty. Michaela didn't allow herself to cry in the hallway. She passed assistants who had once memorized her coffee order. She nodded at a junior analyst who had joked with her in the elevator just days earlier. No one looked closely enough to notice the way her hands trembled inside the pockets of her coat. Only when the elevator doors slid shut did she let the breath she had been holding escape. The ride down felt longer than the building was tall. By the time she reached the lobby, the world outside the glass doors had resumed its rhythm. Cabs idling, people moving, life continuing in perfect disregard of what had just ended 30 floors above. She stepped onto the sidewalk and kept walking, past the cafe where they had once shared breakfast before early meetings, past the corner where he had kissed her goodbye the first morning she stayed over, past the spot where she had once waited in the rain because he'd been late and she hadn't minded at all. She didn't send another message. She didn't look back. That night she packed the apartment that had stopped feeling like hers the moment he told her to face motherhood without him. She took only what fit in 2 suitcases and left the rest. Behind, the cookware they had bought together, the framed print he never liked, the spare toothbrush that no longer had a place to wait. Before she closed the door, she stood in the center of the living room and rested her hand against her stomach. I've got you, she whispered. It was the first promise she made as a mother, and it was the last time Tristan Deca was included in any plan that mattered. Michaela's hometown didn't announce itself with signs or skylines. It revealed itself slowly. A 2-lane road hugging the coast, porches with chipped paint, grocery clerks who remembered faces instead of order numbers. The kind of place people left to build bigger lives, then returned to when they needed to remember who they were. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a silence she had not yet learned how to fill. Her mother met her at the bus station without questions, just a hug that lingered longer than politeness required, arms steady around a daughter who had always pretended she was stronger than she felt. They didn't talk about Tristan. They talked about which room she would use, about the neighbor's new dog, about whether the old rocking chair still creaked. At night, Michaela lay awake listening to waves fold into the shore beyond the window, pressing her hand to her stomach as if to ground herself in the only certainty she had left. She set up a small desk in the corner of her childhood bedroom and continued working remotely, answering emails while nausea came and went in quiet waves. The future felt too large to measure, so she focused on the next task, then the next. Each morning, she walked past the cafe where high school friends now brought their children after school. Each afternoon, she folded tiny clothes that still smelled like factory plastic because she had no one else to shop with yet. She did not explain her choices to anyone. She did not apologize for staying. In a town where nothing was ever fully forgotten, she learned that belonging didn't require perfection. It only asked that you keep showing up, even when you didn't yet know what you were showing up for. Pregnancy wasn't cinematic for Michaela. There were no glowing moments or dramatic revelations. There were grocery lists abandoned halfway through because the smell of detergent made her dizzy. There were afternoons when she sat on the edge of her childhood bed and stared at the wall, counting breaths until the room steadied. Her friends tried to be helpful. They sent texts full of cheerful emojis and offered advice they had learned from online forums. She thanked them all, then turned her phone face down because she didn't know how to translate fear into casual conversation. Money became something she tracked in small increments. She stopped ordering coffee out, learned which meals could stretch for 2 days, folded and refolded the same tiny clothes because preparing felt like progress, even when nothing else did. The doctor's visits were the hardest, not because of the exams, but because every waiting room was full of couples who shared magazines and whispered jokes while she filled out forms alone. She trained herself not to look at them, to focus instead on the steady beat of her own pulse in her ears. She never called Tristan, not out of pride, out of clarity. She understood now that he had never been cruel. He had simply been absent in ways that were invisible until they mattered. There was no space in her life for people who only showed up when things were easy. So she adjusted. She learned how to be both frightened and capable at the same time, how to carry a future that no one else had agreed to help her hold. and somewhere between folded laundry and empty waiting rooms, she stopped feeling abandoned and started feeling responsible. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner. Michaela sat on the exam table, swinging her feet like a child because the paper sheet stuck to the backs of her thighs. She had come alone again, as she always did, carrying a notebook filled with questions she never asked out loud. The technician chatted about weather and traffic while moving the monitor into place. It was meant to distract her, Michaela knew that, but her attention was fixed on the ceiling tiles, counting cracks, tracing shapes, pretending calm could be assembled from repetition. The gel was cold. She flinched, laughed it off, then fell silent when the screen flickered to life. The technician leaned closer, adjusted a dial, shifted the angle, then paused. The room changed without a sound. "Everything okay?" Michaela asked, trying to keep her voice light. The technician smiled too quickly. "Just getting a clearer view." She moved the sensor again, slower this time. Her brows drew together, not in concern, in calculation. Another pause. Michaela's heart picked up a tempo she couldn't control. "I'm going to get the doctor," the technician said, already rolling her chair back. Michaela lay there staring at the ceiling, palms damp against the thin paper beneath her. She had been prepared for 1,000 scenarios, complications, delays, instructions she wouldn't understand, but not for silence that carried meaning. The doctor arrived a moment later, greeting her by name with the calm voice of someone who had delivered news in too many ways to count. He studied the screen without speaking. Then he turned it toward her. "Have you been feeling more tired than expected?" he asked, "and unusually hungry?" She laughed once, breathless. "Constantly." He took a seat beside her. "Well," he said gently, "that makes sense." The doctor didn't rush. He pointed to the screen and explained what she was seeing, tracing small shapes with the tip of his pen while Michaela tried to match his words to the moving shadows in front of her. "One," he said, tapping lightly. "And here's the second." Her hand moved to her mouth without instruction. "And here," he added after a beat, "is the third." For a moment she couldn't speak. She stared at the monitor as if it might correct itself, as if the image would simplify if she waited long enough. 3 shapes. 3 rhythms pulsing in uneven coordination. "Triplets?" she asked finally. He nodded. The word echoed somewhere in her chest, not as fear, but as something dangerously close to laughter. It slipped out before she could stop it, a short, surprised sound that startled them both. "I don't really do anything halfway," she said, blinking back tears. The doctor smiled, relief softening his expression. "You're not the first to respond like that." When she was alone again, she rested both hands over her stomach, thumbs brushing the fabric of her sweater, as if she were counting without numbers. "Well," she whispered, voice trembling into a grin she didn't know how to contain, "you 3 don't waste any time." The room felt different when she stood to leave. Heavier, fuller, like the air itself had gained meaning. In the hallway, couples still whispered over paperwork. Nurses moved past with practiced urgency. Nothing around her had changed, and yet everything had. 3 futures were forming where she had expected one, 3 chances to stay when someone else had chosen to walk away. And as she stepped into the parking lot, sun warming the tops of her shoulders, Michaela understood something with quiet certainty. She wasn't alone anymore. Carrying 3 lives didn't look heroic from the outside. Most days it meant sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, replying to emails between waves of nausea, the screen blurring when she forgot to drink water. It meant setting timers so she wouldn't forget meals, then forcing herself to eat even when nothing appealed. Her body moved at a pace she didn't recognize anymore. Stairs demanded strategy. Grocery trips required rest breaks in the parking lot. She learned which chairs in the house supported her back and which ones she had to abandon without pride. The future pressed in quietly. She built budgets in pencil, erasing more than she wrote. She measured diapers in numbers she didn't yet understand and accepted second-hand cribs with gratitude that sometimes felt heavier than embarrassment. At night, when the house settled, she lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant call of foghorns from the harbor, both reminders that the world continued whether she was ready or not. There were moments when loneliness nearly spoke aloud, when she passed families in the grocery aisle and wondered what it felt like to have someone else reach for the same brand of cereal. When she set up the 3 bassinets in a room that once held a single twin bed and stood there afterward, unsure whether to feel proud or overwhelmed. She never called Tristan, not because she had forgotten him, because remembering was easier than explaining. She focused instead on the small victories, a completed project, a walk that didn't leave her breathless, a day when fear stayed quiet. Life without him wasn't dramatic. It was work. News traveled quickly in a town where people still read expressions instead of profiles. By her second trimester, Michaela no longer needed to explain herself. Casseroles appeared at the door with no note attached. A neighbor fixed the loose hinge on her back door and left before she could offer thanks. Someone she barely knew from high school dropped off a stack of baby blankets tied with twine. She accepted the help without questions, not because she felt weak, but because she was learning the difference between charity and care. On Sundays, her mother insisted on walking with her along the shoreline path, moving at whatever pace the day allowed. They spoke about nothing important, the gulls that followed fishing boats, the way the tide rearranged the beach every morning. But the rhythm of their steps settled something restless in Michaela's chest. One afternoon, her former English teacher stopped her outside the grocery store and asked how she was really doing. The answer surprised them both. "I'm tired," Michaela said. "But I'm okay." And she was, not fearless, not certain, but held by hands that didn't require explanation, by a place that had known her before she learned to hide. She hung the tiny clothes in 3 neat rows across a line in the backyard and stood there watching them flutter, not imagining a perfect future, just allowing herself to believe in one that wasn't solitary. She still didn't reach for her phone. She didn't need to. The life growing inside her had already rearranged the definition of support. The night labor began. Rain pressed against the windows as if the sky had chosen to keep her company. Her mother drove while Michaela counted breaths and tried not to think in numbers larger than 1. The hospital lights were too bright, the hallways too long, the words multiple delivery floating around her like something she had agreed to without ever signing. The hours folded together, hands appeared, voices instructed, machines offered reassurance in tones she trusted more than her own instincts. She remembered gripping the edge of the bed and thinking, not about pain, but about how much space a heart could stretch before it gave way. The first cry was small, the second was stronger. By the time the third filled the room, Michaela was laughing through tears she didn't bother to hide. They placed them against her one at a time, tiny weight, warmer than expected, unfamiliar in ways that felt immediate rather than frightening. 3 different faces, 3 different breaths, already distinct, already refusing to blend into a single idea. Her mother stood nearby, hands over her mouth, eyes bright with disbelief that had nothing to do with fear. Later, when the room quieted and the world narrowed to a hum of monitors, Michaela lay there listening to 3 rhythms that no longer came from her body. She had expected relief. What she felt instead was resolve. This wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about staying present for moments that didn't wait, a stretch of fingers, a sound that didn't yet count as laughter, the way each child settled into sleep differently. Somewhere in the early hours, before dawn, she reached for her phone out of habit. She didn't open any names. She set it back down. Because for the first time since that glass-walled office, she wasn't thinking about what had been taken from her. She was thinking about what had arrived. Mornings lost their meaning after the first month. Time no longer moved in hours, but in needs. Feeding schedules that overlapped before they finished. Naps that never aligned. Laundry that never seemed to belong to the same day twice. Michaela learned to measure rest in fragments. 10 minutes while 3 small bodies slept in uneven surrender. A sip of coffee gone cold before it touched her lips. The strange relief of standing in the shower simply because the door was closed. The house filled with sound, not noise, life. A rhythm that had nothing to do with order and everything to do with presence. She stopped expecting quiet and began expecting moments. The way one child curled into sleep when she hummed off-key. The way another kicked free of blankets like it was an insult. The third who stared back at her as if already evaluating the world. There were days she forgot to eat lunch. Days she forgot she had once worn heels. But there were also mornings when she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, hair unbrushed, shirt inside out, holding 3 futures that trusted her without reservation. Those were the days she didn't feel alone. Not because help was constant, but because purpose was. Life without him didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full in ways she had never known how to imagine. 18 months passed without resistance. Tristan closed deals that made industry blogs trail his name. His calendar thickened with invitations that implied prestige rather than asked for it. There were celebrations where champagne appeared before he knew what had been agreed to. And yet, every achievement landed without weight. He returned each night to a penthouse that still looked untouched, the way hotel rooms do after you've stayed too long to remember what you brought in. The suit jacket still went over the chair. The light still obeyed his voice. The refrigerator still held more bottles than meals. People around him called it focus. He called it efficiency. But the word had begun to feel like a placeholder for something he could not name. He stopped checking his personal messages altogether, letting them pile into quiet archives he never opened. His phone became a tool rather than a tether, a way to manage transactions without ever allowing interruption. Some nights he sat at the edge of his bed with no screen in his hand and tried to remember when he had last been surprised by anything that wasn't a market shift. The answer disturbed him. It had been the day Michaela stood behind him in his office. That was the last time his life had refused to follow a plan. And while he would never have admitted it, something about the way time kept moving without her in it felt less like progress and more like repetition. a series of victories that no longer seemed to belong to anyone but him. Tristan never searched for her. That was the rule he pretended was discipline. He avoided her name the way some people avoid certain streets, not because they are dangerous, but because they lead places you aren't prepared to revisit. If a memory surfaced, he redirected his attention to something measurable, something that did not require reflection. Still, traces of her found him. A song drifting from a cafe doorway that reminded him of the way she hummed when she cooked. The smell of lemon cleaner in hotel bathrooms. The word home, printed in a font meant to sell furniture. He dismissed each moment with the practiced thought, that chapter is closed. Yet closure, he discovered, wasn't something you decided. It was something that happened only when there was nothing left to ask, and he was beginning to realize how many questions he had avoided. How had she managed on her own? Had she stayed in the city or gone somewhere quieter? Had she ever wished he'd chosen differently? These thoughts arrived uninvited, usually when he was between places, in elevators, in the back seats of town cars, waiting for flights that were never late. He told himself that reaching out would only reopen what had been sealed with intention. But intention, stripped of courage, was just another way to remain unchanged. And in the spaces between meetings, between cities, between the versions of himself he showed the world, Tristan felt the faint pull of something he could no longer reduce to a problem. Not regret, recognition that the silence he had built his life around had begun to answer back. A flight was supposed to be routine, a short hop to a client presentation he could deliver in his sleep. He arrived early, moved through security with the ease of someone who traveled often enough to forget that most people found it stressful. He checked his phone while walking, responding to emails that had already lost their urgency by the time he hit send. Then something in his periphery slowed him, a voice that didn't belong to anyone he knew, laughter that didn't carry expectation, the kind that existed only because the world was still new enough to be interesting. He looked up. Across the terminal, a woman struggled to keep 3 toddlers from exploring everything at once. One reached for a stranger's rolling bag. Another tried to crawl beneath a row of seats. The third stood perfectly still, studying the room like it was a question. Recognition took a second longer than it should have. Michaela. He stopped walking. His phone slipped from his hand, and time, for once, didn't move on without him. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check him. For a moment, Tristan couldn't tell whether the scene was real or the mind's habit of replaying unfinished conversations. Michaela looked different, not in the obvious ways, but in the way people change when they have stopped waiting for approval. Her shoulders were set differently, her movements less tentative. She bent to catch one child just as another tugged at her sleeve, the choreography of it all practiced, unannounced. She hadn't seen him yet. He could have turned away. No one would have known. The terminal was large enough to swallow anyone who didn't wish to be found, and he had perfected that art. But something in the way she laughed, not at the children but with them, held him where he stood. One of the toddlers broke from her grip and drifted closer to him, inspecting his shoes with open curiosity. "Hi, mister," the child said, with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned fear. The words settled into him without asking permission. He knelt before he realized he had moved. "Hello," he replied, unsure of what else a man could say to a stranger who somehow already belonged to him. Michaela looked up then. Her eyes met his, not with shock, but with recognition that carried no accusation. Just awareness, as if she had always known this day would arrive, not in a calendar, but in principle. "They're beautiful," he said. The sentence came out fractured, like it had traveled a long way to reach him. She studied him for a moment, measuring not his suit or his posture, but his stillness. "They're yours," she said. 3 words, steady as anything he had ever signed his name to. And for the first time since the office, Tristan Deco had no prepared response. They stood there longer than anyone should in the middle of a terminal. Travelers flowed around them, tugging luggage, checking screens, unaware that something irreversible had just occurred in their path. Tristan looked from one child to the next as if he were searching for a detail that would correct the situation, a different shade of hair, a familiar expression that would allow him to categorize what he was seeing. Instead, he found fragments of himself in each face, small confirmations that did not invite debate. "Do they have names?" he asked. Michaela gave them one at a time, her voice unadorned, as if she were reciting something that had already become ordinary to her. The children watched him with interest that hadn't yet learned caution. One reached for his tie, fascinated by the movement of the fabric. "Pretty string," she announced. A sound escaped his throat that startled him. It wasn't laughter exactly, more like surprise at the fact that he could still make that noise, not as an invitation, as a statement of reality. And he followed, because for the first time in years, he didn't know how to walk away. The cafe was too small for what was happening inside it. Tristan perched on the edge of a chair while the children colored on napkins with crayons Michaela had pulled from her bag like she had prepared for moments no one else could anticipate. "They laugh in their sleep," she said, watching the smallest press purple wax into a swirl, sometimes all at once. "It's like they've agreed on a joke I'll never hear." His eyes stayed on their hands. "I missed everything," he said, not as a confession, as a discovery. Michaela studied him, not with anger, not with expectation, but with the careful attention you give someone who has finally decided to listen. "You weren't protecting yourself back then," she said. "You were hiding." The sentence did not accuse. It clarified. One of the children slid from their chair and pressed both palms against his knee, as if testing whether he was solid. He looked down, startled by the certainty of the contact. "Do you know how to build towers?" the child asked. He shook his head. "Well," she replied, considering him with authority she had not earned but did not need, "you can learn." Something inside him shifted, not with force, but with permission. He glanced back at Michaela and, for the first time since that office, did not try to organize what he felt into something manageable. He simply let it exist. They didn't talk about the past, not because it didn't matter, but because the present was already asking more than either of them had prepared for. Tristan watched as Michaela packed crayons back into her bag, the movements automatic, as practiced as breathing. He noticed how one child leaned against her leg when tired, how another insisted on helping fold the napkins, how the third examined the sugar packets like they held secrets. These weren't visitors in her life. They were its structure. "I have a flight," he said, then paused. The sentence no longer felt complete on its own, "but I can change it." The word surprised him. Not because he had never rearranged a schedule, but because he had never done it for a reason that wasn't strategic. Michaela didn't answer immediately. She looked at the children, then back at him, searching not for commitment but for sincerity. "Come by this weekend," she said. "We'll be home." It wasn't forgiveness. It was access. He nodded once, the way he used to when signing off on something that couldn't be undone. As they stood to leave, one child took his hand without hesitation, fingers curling into his as if it were the most natural motion in the world. He didn't pull away. He didn't tighten his grip either. He simply walked with them toward the exit, aware of every step, as though learning a new way to move through space. The terminal doors opened, and cool air swept in from outside. For the first time in his life, Tristan Deco let a meeting wait. Tristan drove the coastal road without using his navigation system. The houses thinned as the city receded behind him, replaced by stretches of water that reflected a sky too wide to measure. He had changed flights before, delayed meetings without apology, but this was the first time he had redirected himself without knowing what waited at the end of the route. Michaela's home sat at the edge of a narrow street lined with low fences and uneven mailboxes. The paint on the porch rail had begun to peel, but someone had planted flowers anyway. He cut the engine and stayed in the car longer than necessary. Through the front window he could see movement, a small figure darting past, another trailing behind. The house was alive in ways his own had never been. When he finally stepped onto the porch, he heard laughter before the door opened. Michaela stood there holding one child while the other two peered around her legs as if he were a puzzle. "You found us," she said, not as a greeting, as acknowledgement. Inside, the room smelled faintly of detergent and something sweet baking in the oven. Toys were arranged in clusters that suggested logic only to those who lived among them. He removed his jacket without being asked, unsure where to place it in a space that did not belong to systems. One of the children took his hand again, leading him toward the living room carpet with confidence that made him forget he was a guest. He knelt, awkward and off balance, and felt the unfamiliar certainty of being expected to stay. The children eventually scattered to different corners of the room, each absorbed in their own private investigation of the world. That left the two of them standing at opposite ends of the kitchen counter, the hum of the dishwasher filling the silence they hadn't agreed on. "I didn't know," Tristan said at last. It was the only true sentence he had. Michaela didn't answer immediately. She poured water into 2 glasses, slid one across the counter, then leaned back against the cabinet as if she were choosing her next words carefully. "You didn't ask," she replied. He nodded, accepting the distinction without defense. "I thought I was being practical," he said. "I thought that was enough." Her gaze softened, not because she agreed, but because she had moved beyond needing him to. "Practical for who?" she asked. The question landed without malice. It didn't seek blame, only clarity. "I was afraid," he admitted, surprising himself. "Not of the baby, of myself," she considered that. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "Fear doesn't make people disappear. Choices do." The sentence settled between them with the steadiness of a rule. From the living room came the sound of something toppling over, followed by laughter loud enough to erase any illusion that this conversation could be paused. Tristan turned toward the noise, then back to her. I don't know how to do this, he said. Michaela met his eyes, finally allowing a trace of warmth to return. You don't have to know, she replied. You just have to stay. They didn't resolve anything that afternoon. There were no promises signed, no declarations that belonged in a speech. What they did instead was measure time differently, not in years or regrets, but in the next small interval that asked for attention. Tristan stayed while Michaela prepared dinner, holding one child on his hip with a stiffness that slowly eased into something workable. Another insisted he taste a spoonful of sauce with a seriousness usually reserved for official duties. The third trailed behind him, carrying a wooden block like a badge of office. When he rose to leave, the word later hovered in the air between them. I'll come back, he said. She didn't say she hoped so. She said, we'll be here. Outside, the ocean could be heard beyond the houses, steady in a way that didn't require explanation. Tristan sat in his car for a long moment before turning the key, hands resting on the steering wheel without purpose. He had entered the day with a flight number and left with something less precise, a direction that could not be plotted. He drove away without the familiar sensation of escape. This time, the space behind him didn't feel like distance. It felt like room to return. Tristan didn't arrive with confidence. He arrived with mismatched socks, a coffee he forgot to drink, and the uneasy awareness that no one in the room expected him to lead. The children greeted him with noise rather than ceremony. One tugged at his coat pocket, another pushed a plastic truck into his leg with quiet insistence. He stood there unsure whether to crouch, kneel, or retreat behind the furniture. So he did all three. He learned quickly that staying meant surrendering rhythm. The day didn't adjust to him. He adjusted to it. Lunch happened when it happened. Silence came in narrow windows that closed without notice. He followed Michaela through routines he had never practiced, washing tiny hands, choosing between shoes that looked identical to him, reading stories whose pages were already soft from use. Mistakes arrived without drama. He fastened a shirt backward and laughed when no one corrected him. He learned that tears required patience rather than logic. That attention was more valuable than explanation. Each small task asked him to remain where he would once have moved on. And when he left that evening, he didn't check his watch. He checked his pockets to make sure he hadn't taken anything that didn't belong to him, a small gesture that surprised him with its sincerity. For the first time in his adult life, Tristan Deco did not leave a place cleaner than he found it. He left it lived in. He began arriving every weekend, not with announcements or gifts meant to impress, but with groceries that matched the list taped to the refrigerator and clothes he didn't mind getting stained. The children stopped treating him like a visitor and started treating him like furniture, climbing him without warning, leaving toys in his pockets, assuming his presence without asking. He learned how to braid hair badly but with commitment, how to cut sandwiches into shapes that didn't resemble any known object, how to listen to stories that wandered in circles and still feel as if he'd been told something important. Michaela didn't praise him. She didn't need to. She folded him into the routine without commentary, the way you make room for something that has decided to stay. The house absorbed him slowly. His jacket began to hang on the same hook each time. A toothbrush appeared beside the sink without ceremony. One of the children claimed his shoes as a hiding place for treasures he never found until he tried to leave. There were no milestones worth posting, just repetition. And in that repetition, Tristan noticed something unfamiliar, a sense of usefulness that didn't come from influence or results. It came from proximity, from being where he was needed before anyone had to ask. It was not the kind of progress he could chart, but it was the kind that left traces. One evening, after the children had been tucked into their uneven patterns of sleep, Tristan stood in the doorway longer than necessary. The room glowed with the muted light of a lamp shaped like a cloud. 3 small chests rose and fell at different tempos, already asserting their independence. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. Michaela leaned against the frame beside him, arms crossed not in defense, but in fatigue. No, she replied, but you can choose it. The words settled deeper than praise ever had, because choice implied effort. It implied returning tomorrow when nothing felt urgent, and the day after that when nothing felt rewarding. It implied carrying weight without expecting recognition. Later, as he drove back to the city, he noticed how light the road felt without the familiar urge to outpace it. The radio remained off. His thoughts, once always ahead of him, lingered on the curve of a child's fingers around his, on the way one of them had fallen asleep mid-sentence. He didn't try to sort these impressions into outcomes. He let them remain what they were. That night, the penthouse did not feel hostile. It felt temporary. And that, more than anything else, told him he was beginning to stay somewhere he had never intended to live. He began altering his schedule in ways no one noticed but him. Flights booked later. Meetings declined without apology. Weekends blocked out not for rest, but for presence. He didn't explain the changes because he no longer needed approval to justify them. Michaela watched without comment as his habits shifted. He learned where the spare diapers were kept. He learned that one child refused naps unless a story came first, that another needed to be rocked twice before sleep took hold, that the third pretended independence but always circled back for reassurance. Staying became less of a decision and more of a pattern. The sharp edges of his former life dulled. The city stopped calling his name when he wasn't there to answer it. The penthouse remained pristine, but it no longer felt like a destination, only a waypoint between weekends. And when he found himself smiling at nothing while folding tiny shirts that would never fit him, he understood something that no boardroom had ever taught him. Escape had once felt like freedom. Now it felt like absence. There was no moment when they decided to begin again. It happened between tasks, a shared look over the sink filled with bottles, a brush of fingers when passing a plate across the table, a familiarity that returned without asking whether it was allowed. They didn't revisit the past in detail. They didn't measure apologies. They allowed space to do what speeches would have ruined. Some evenings, after the children were asleep, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, exhaustion forming a truce neither of them named. On others, Michaela rested her head against his shoulder because there was nowhere else left to lean. He did not promise permanence. He demonstrated it. Through grocery lists that included things he didn't eat, through errands that ended at playgrounds instead of restaurants, through the way he listened without interrupting, no longer trying to simplify conversations that didn't fit his former language. It wasn't romance. It was recognition. And it felt steadier than anything he had built before. One night, after the dishwasher finished its cycle and the house finally allowed silence, Michaela spoke without looking at him. "I'm still scared." The admission did not seek comfort. It sought honesty. He turned toward her, uncertain where to place his hands when the moment didn't ask for fixing. "Of what?" he asked. She considered the question longer than it deserved. "That one day I'll look up and you'll be gone again," she said. "Not because you don't care, but because it's what you know how to do." He didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. He reached for her hand slowly, not to reassure her, but to connect something he had once treated as optional. "I don't know how to prove the future," he said. "I only know how to choose today." She leaned into his shoulder then, not with relief, but with resolve, the kind that forms when people stop pretending safety is guaranteed. And that was enough. They didn't mark the change with a date. There was no anniversary to remember, no photograph to archive the moment things began to heal. What they noticed instead were the absences, the missing tension, the missing urge to brace for departure. Tristan stopped packing an overnight bag. He left clothes in the dresser that wasn't his. He learned which light in the hallway flickered and fixed it without asking permission. He set his phone on the counter during dinner and forgot to pick it up again. Michaela watched these details accumulate without commentary. She trusted patterns more than statements. Some nights they fell asleep on opposite sides of the bed with a child tucked between them, exhaustion overriding romance. Other nights they lay awake sharing fragments of their days that didn't require resolution. It wasn't dramatic, it was durable. And for the first time since that office, Tristan didn't feel as though he was visiting someone else's life. He felt as though he was inhabiting his own. The first thing Tristan noticed wasn't dissatisfaction, it was misalignment. Boardroom victories no longer landed where they used to. Applause felt delayed, like sound echoing after the meaning had passed. He still spoke with authority, still moved numbers in directions others admired. But something in him had shifted its center of gravity. He found himself checking the time not to move faster, but to see whether he could leave earlier. Questions surfaced that would have once felt irresponsible. How much is enough? Who am I building this for? He watched other executives boast about hours logged and flights taken, and instead of admiration he felt distance. Their lives looked impressive in profile, but thin in practice. What unsettled him most was how obvious the difference had become. Presence had weight. He felt it when one of the children reached for him without looking. When Michaela asked his opinion not out of need, but trust. These moments didn't compete with his career. They reframed it. Power, he realized, had always asked him to leave something behind. Presence asked him to remain, and the longer he stayed, the clearer it became that success measured without witnesses wasn't success at all. It was accumulation without inheritance. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life where ambition didn't require distance, where arriving somewhere mattered more than arriving ahead of everyone else. The idea frightened him. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt final. He didn't resign in a blaze of headlines. He negotiated a transition that would have once felt like retreat. Fewer days in the city, remote oversight, responsibility shared instead of hoarded. The board accepted it with mild surprise and quiet relief. Legends, after all, were expensive to maintain. Tristan traded glass-walled offices for rooms that held fingerprints on every surface. He brought his laptop to the dining table and discovered how often it closed on its own when someone needed help with a puzzle or a spilled drink. The penthouse began to empty without ceremony. A bookshelf was shipped south. A painting went to auction. He noticed how little of his former life resisted being packed. What surprised him most was not the reduction, it was the expansion. Days felt fuller even when they held less. He woke with purpose that didn't require validation. He learned the tide schedule and planned walks around it instead of around meetings. The city still existed. It simply stopped demanding tribute. The children did not notice his career shift. They noticed only that he was there when they woke, that his shoes appeared by the door without question, that his laugh belonged in the house rather than echoing from a phone. One evening, as the light softened across the living room, he found himself seated on the floor assembling a structure that leaned more than it stood. Again, one child insisted after it toppled. He smiled and started over without calculation. Later, when they had drifted into sleep and the house had exhaled, Michaela rested beside him on the couch, their shoulders touching not by accident but by habit. "You stayed," she said, not with surprise, with recognition. He did not answer immediately, because staying was no longer something he needed to announce. It was something he practiced. One night, the three children fell asleep tangled between them, limbs claiming territory that neither adult had the heart to reclaim. The room held a quiet that didn't ask for explanation, the kind that settles only when nothing is waiting to be decided. Michaela traced a small circle on the back of Tristan's hand, the gesture so familiar it went unnoticed until it was already happening. "I used to think strength meant doing it alone," she said. "Now I think it means knowing when not to." He watched the rise and fall of the small chests between them, each breath a continuation of a choice he had once tried to delete. "I thought leaving made things simpler," he replied. "All it did was delay the hard parts. They lay there without seeking closure, because life had given them something better, continuity, not a promise of perfection, a pattern of return. Before you go, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked away from a moment because staying felt inconvenient, only to realize later that inconvenience was the doorway to something that mattered? If this story stirred that question in you, take a second to leave a comment. Share the moment you wish you had handled differently, or the one you're still learning to face. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Cooper Stories so you don't miss the next chapter about the choices that shape us long after they're made. Because Tristan Dechau didn't become a different man when he saw his children. He became a man willing to remain. Sometimes the decision that breaks your life open is the same one that teaches you how to live inside it. Love doesn't demand flawless people. It asks only that you don't walk away.